Is PBS in survival mode? Hey folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I'm a scholar of resistance history in the American Revolution at the University of Southern Denmark and Johns Hopkins. And I've been tagged a lot in this video on TikTok and Instagram, and maybe you've seen it. But if you haven't, let's take a look.
Is there a little known fact about Thomas Jefferson that more people should know?
An important thing to remember when we think about Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress is it was a gathering of young and rather ordinary people. So at the time of the writing of the Declaration, Jefferson was in his early 30s. He was still relatively newly married, and the life of his wife and growing family here was foremost in his mind. As he was thinking with a group of like-minded men and all of the women and laborers, enslaved and free, who made up their worlds, about the kind of world they wanted to build.
Okay, that's Jane Kamensky. No shade if you don't know who she is. She's a historian, used to be at Harvard, and now she's head of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home in Virginia. And this is part of PBS's promotion of Ken Burns' upcoming series on the American Revolution, clearly trying to reach the kids. Now, Kamensky isn't a historian of the American Revolution, nor is she a historian of Thomas Jefferson, so it's a wonder for anybody why she's at Monticello. But we can't really care too much about that. The bigger issue is what PBS, by promoting all of this, is telegraphing. So let's work through it. Kamensky here is asked what people should know about Thomas Jefferson that they might not otherwise know. And Kamensky's response is people should know the Continental Congress was made up of rather young and ordinary people. And that Jefferson was thinking with a group of like-minded men and all of the women and laborers, enslaved and free, who made up their worlds, about the kind of world they wanted to build. Go back and listen to it again. And then let's sit with all of it, just for some excruciating moments. Enslaved people were thinking with Jefferson about the world they wanted to build. They were people whom, and the others insisted, were property. And he claimed to own almost 200 of them, about 180 in July 1776. Did they have much voice in his deliberations? Did they have much of a seat at his table? Did they have a vote in his revolution? Almost 36 of them actually left Monticello and Jefferson's other plantations in order to go to the British during the Revolution. So one suggests that whatever they were thinking, they were not thinking with Jefferson. They might have been thinking against them. And at best for Jefferson, before the birth of Sally Hemings, I suspect, there were numbers on a ledger, right? There are a cash register that just keeps producing ka-ching. And yet PBS here is promoting the suggestion that they were somehow a part of the spirit of '76. And let's also take a quick look at the young and ordinary thing, which is a weird myth that keeps popping up on digital media, and it's wrong. It's wrong, folks. Stop thinking about history in terms of musicals. Yeah, they were kind of young, but the question you have to ask is whether they were uniquely young. Were they especially young? And what those young people were actually doing. The Continental Congress's average age, 1776, the Second Continental Congress, was about 44, nearly the same as the British Parliament at exactly the same time, which was about 45, with plenty of people in their 20s in the British Parliament. And more to the point, and what Kamensky ignores because, context, the youngest members of the Second Continental Congress were actually its most conservative ones. She makes a point that they're all revolutionaries. Well, it's tough to be revolutionary when you're not Rutledge, and you're only there because your wealth and enslaved people meant you didn't have to do anything else. So they ended up being among the strongest supporters of slavery, and crucially for this point, the most opposed to independence. These are young revolutionaries. Of the 8 members younger than Jefferson in the Second Continental Congress, 6 were enslavers and 4 opposed independence. Several didn't even sign the Declaration. And one, right, the youngest, Ed Rutledge, fought against it until the very end. They weren't revolutionaries saying, let's do this thing. They were the ones saying, no, let's not do this thing. They were trying to prevent it. And they were among the wealthiest people out of 2.5 million in the whole country. In what universe is the 1% ordinary? If they were ordinary, they wouldn't have been there. That's the history. But it's also consistent with a different narrative, and that's the bigger issue. So let's talk about it. As many of you know, we've talked about it here before, and we should talk about it more. PBS was stripped of its federal funding, $1.1 billion gone, and local stations are already starting to shut down. PBS's survival as an institution, as a national treasure really, is genuinely threatened. It's on the edge. So when we see PBS promoting a clip that transforms slaveholders into ordinary people and enslaved men and women into partners in an American revolution for liberty, we've got to wonder, is this what institutional survival looks like today? Is PBS, with the help of Ken Burns and a bunch of liberal nationalists, trying to thread an impossible needle? And there's a bigger issue here that we need to grapple with. Control over who the founders were and what they intended is a major political battleground. Just yesterday, Chicago's mayor invoked the founders to argue against Trump's deployment of federal troops there. Everyone wants to claim the founders for their side. And the question then is, which version of the founders will prevail? My question is, should any? But the other question is, what role does public media play in that battle for setting up the context for you to make decisions on your own? And the timing suggests that none of this is accidental. Burns' American Revolution series premieres next month, and PBS is pulling out all the stops for it. I mean, think about it. This is a major investment for PBS, and it needs to pay off with its donor base while not agitating the regime further. And Ken Burns and Kamensky are perfect for that. They can kid themselves that young people are getting somewhere near it. They're not. But the aging boomers who remain PBS's primary donor pool are going to love it, and PBS needs them to keep loving it. And they aren't up for being challenged about the great men of American history. They want to hear they were ordinary because they were white people with resources. They want a comfortable fiction that flatters both the founders and, frankly, it flatters themselves. And that cozy, comfortable nationalist message, let's call it masterpiece history, is actually exactly the story that the Trump regime once told about America's founding. Go right now, stop this, to the White House's website to check out its American Revolution 250 content. There's a lot of it there. It's spot on consistent with Burns' work. And Kamensky's interview seems to deliver exactly the same narrative, one that minimizes slavery and makes the founders relatable to young people by erasing the oppression they relied on. But here's where we can be torn, because PBS faces an impossible situation. They're trying to survive, like almost everybody, in an environment where their existence is under direct attack. Maybe they think, and you can't blame them if they do, strategic compromises now will let them preserve their infrastructure for better times. Maybe they believe some public media is better than none. Trim your sails, wait for calmer seas. PBS doesn't have to consciously capitulate. They can just do what their biggest revenue source wants, which happens to align with what the regime wants. Burns can make his usual sentimental, sweeping documentary about brave young men forging a nation. Kamensky and others can provide a sort of scholarly veneer. Donors can feel cultured and patriotic, and the White House gets its 250th anniversary propaganda that it can be happy with. Everyone wins, except for you, except for us. And so maybe we just need to think about our response more carefully. If PBS is going to air problematic content, in this Ken Burns series, it's clearly headed in that direction, our job isn't to abandon them, but to create alternative engagement for those programs that boost what it is that PBS is trying to do. There are good people there. We should help them do what it is that I'm sure they want to do anyway. And make sure that we can actually use their platform against that narrative, but in support of what it is that they're doing. And we also need to increase support for local PBS stations directly. Many local stations have more editorial independence than many think, and they could become sites of resistance, even as the national programming becomes perhaps problematic. But we need to be fairly clear about what's happening. When institutions compromise on fundamental truths, like pretending enslaved people were partners in their own oppression, oh boy, let's continue slavery for the next 80 years. My grandchildren will think it's just fine. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Before long, you're promoting narratives that serve power rather than challenging it, all while telling yourself that you're just making history accessible. The founders weren't gods, but they definitely weren't ordinary people. They were hypocrites who pronounced soaring ideals and acted through brutal systems of oppression. That's not a contradiction we can smooth over. It's facts over feelings. Is PBS okay? I don't think they are. They're in survival mode. And that survival seems to require compromising historical truth at exactly the moment when we need that truth most. A commitment to truth is resistance, everyday resistance, because abusive authority requires lies to maintain and expand their claims to legitimacy. So every time that you tell the truth, every time that you promote honest history, you're taking a bite out of the regime's claims to authority. So maybe the question isn't whether to support PBS, but how to support it while vigorously contesting the narratives it's under pressure, politically and financially, to promote. Because whoever controls the story of who we were will shape the understanding of who we're allowed to become today. And that's a battle we can't afford to lose, even if, especially if, we have to fight on complicated terrain.